It started out as a tragic accident, but the actions that immediately followed turned this case into a murder of the most heinous kind. It centres around a person who held another's life in their hands, but a rash decision sparked an act of self-preservation that would have tragic consequences for both of them. Hello and welcome back to the Little Shop of Crime, curators and purveyors of all things macabre and mysterious. My name is Steve, and today's case, I'm not going to lie, it's pretty messed up. But before we investigate, I offer both solved and unsolved cases weekly, so if you enjoy true crime stories that are unusual or interesting, please subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss any of my uploads. And if you have any case suggestions that you'd like me to cover, drop them in the comments. Or you can find my social media accounts to DM me or my contact information in the description below. Okay, here we go. This is the tragic case of Gregory Biggs. Today we are heading back to the good old US of A and to the second largest state, Texas. And the events of this particular case take place in the state's fifth largest city, Fort Worth. Located just 32 miles west of Dallas and with a population just shy of 1 million, Fort Worth's roots are laid historically in military and cattle drives, proudly starting off as an army outpost before establishing itself as a centre of the Texas long-haul cattle trade. Yeehaw! But today the skyline is a sprawling metropolis punctuated with traditional Western architecture. And Fort Worth has it all. Skyscrapers, museums, zoos, sports venues, and lots of parks. 263 of them to be exact. One of which is Cobb Park. And that's exactly where our story begins on October 27th, 2001, when police received a call from off-duty firefighter Todd Breedlove, who'd been alerted to the fact there was a body on a bench inside the park. Police investigated the scene and discovered a body of a male in his 30s, and he was in bad shape to say the least. He had a broken right arm, and his right thigh bone and shin bones were also broken. There were several gouges and cuts to his torso, and his left leg was almost completely amputated at the knee. What was strange though was that there wasn't any blood around the scene, so it was obvious he'd been moved there after death. Police quickly identified the man as Gregory Glenn Biggs, a 37-year-old brickmason, and it's fair to say he was down on his luck even before his death. Gregory married in 1982 after his girlfriend Tammy became pregnant with their son Brandon. But a year after his son was born, Gregory began to exhibit signs of bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, and Tammy sought a divorce soon after. Described by those who knew him as handsome, hardworking, caring and kind, his kindness would turn out to be his downfall. He later started a new relationship with a woman who had fallen on tough times, and he decided to lend her some money. But she didn't pay him back, and so he fell behind on his truck payments, and that got repossessed. And without his truck he couldn't work, and without work he couldn't pay for his house or his medication. And so eventually he ended up mentally unbalanced and homeless, living on the streets of Fort Worth, in and out of shelters, but still seeing Brandon whenever he could. The autopsy results came back and determined that Gregory died from blood loss and that his injuries were the result of blunt force trauma, most likely a hit and run. And like many hit and run incidents, the case quickly went cold. 4 months would pass with no leads until, out of nowhere, police received a phone call from a woman named Miranda Daniel, who said she might have information regarding a hit-and-run victim. The previous evening she'd been at a party when an acquaintance, Chante Mallard, had said, "I hit this white man," and had even been laughing and joking about it. At first, police thought it was a prank call, but they decided to follow up on the lead. Chante Mallard was a 25-year-old nursing assistant with 7 years' experience in an elderly care home, and on February 26, 2002, more than a dozen officers turned up at her house with a search warrant. As soon as she opened the door and took one look at the officers, she said, "It was an accident. I'm not a bad person. It all happened so fast. I've never even had a speeding ticket." In the garage, they found her car, a Chevrolet Cavalier with significant damage to the hood and front bumper, and with the windshield almost completely missing, along with much of the interior. In the backyard, they found both front seats, which had extensive fire damage. Officers discovered significant blood evidence on both the outside and the inside of the vehicle. Dark staining on the garage floor turned out to be blood from Gregory, and his hair was found amongst fragments of the windshield. Chante Mallard was arrested that day and charged with failing to stop and render aid. She was released on bond the same day, but a week later, after autopsy results were re-examined, she was again arrested, but this time she was charged with murder and tampering with evidence, and her bail was set at $250,000. But what exactly had happened? At around 11 p.m, Chante had arrived at the apartment of her friend Titilise Fry, known as T. Fry. There they had one drink each and split an ecstasy tablet, this being Chante's first time using the drug. Then they got into Chante's car and began the 20-minute drive over to Joe's Big Bamboo, where it was 69-cent drink night. On the way they smoked a joint and they arrived at the club just before midnight, where they met with friends Cleet Jackson and Herbert Tyrone. There they had a good time, they laughed, they danced, and they had 3 or 4 cocktails each before leaving at around 2:30 a.m. At this point, Chante made motions to drive, but T. Fry stopped her and drove both of them back to her apartment in Chante's car. Then T. Fry offered to follow Chante home to make sure she got back safely, but Chante just left and T. Fry just went to sleep. At around 3:30 a.m, T. Fry received a call from Chante, who sounded really scared. She begged her to come over and pick her up, and so T. Fry immediately got in her car and drove straight round to Chante's house. And as soon as she arrived, before she could even get out of the car, Chante just ran out of her house, jumped in T. Fry's car, and screamed at her hysterically to just drive. And as they drove around, Chante tearfully explained the shocking story of exactly what had happened. Under the influence of the cocktail of ecstasy, marijuana and alcohol, Chante left T. Fry's apartment and drove towards her house. As she was driving along 287 North, which is a 6-lane highway, right before the Village Creek exit, somewhere around here, she hit Gregory Biggs. She was driving so fast that the force of the impact caused Gregory to penetrate the windshield head first, lodging his upper body inside the vehicle, leaving his legs partially outside. As Chante herself testified, she remembers an impact and then just the deafening sound of wind rushing into the car and glass flying everywhere, stinging her skin. And then she looked up to see a man sticking head first through her windshield with his head resting on the footwell of her car, and with a partially severed leg on her dashboard. And he was still alive. She immediately stopped, got out of the car and looked at Gregory. And she tried to pull him from the windshield with his intact leg, but he was too heavy. And this was when she made the fateful decision that would change both of their lives forever. Shockingly, despite her being a medically trained nurse, she didn't stop or get help or call an ambulance. She just got back in the car and drove towards her house, which was about a mile away. Gregory was moaning throughout the entire journey, so he was definitely still alive and likely still conscious, and with his legs described as going in directions that no one thought humanly possible. She was less than half a mile away from the fire station where her brother worked. Plus, she drove past 9 payphones where she could have dialed 911. But instead, she just parked her car in the garage with Gregory Biggs still impaled in her windscreen, and she just closed the door. At this point, Gregory was bleeding heavily, conscious and begging for help, but Chante just cried and kept apologising to him, but made absolutely no effort to seek any medical help. Eventually, she just said sorry, turned off the garage light and walked into her house, leaving him alone and in the dark. And this was when she made the desperate call to T. Fry. And while awaiting her arrival, she would periodically go into the garage and speak with Gregory, apologising for what had happened, but also telling him that she doesn't know what to do. And she just ignored his pleas for help and his moans, and she just waited for him to bleed out, which would have taken about 2 long and agonising hours. T. Fry and Chante drove around for about an hour before they both went back to Chante's house. T. Fry took one look inside the garage where she saw Gregory Biggs still impaled in the windshield, apparently appearing deceased at this point. And after begging her to call 911, eventually she just turned to Chante and she said, "I don't want anything to do with this." Later that morning, Chante asked Cleet Jackson to come over. He was one of the friends that had been at the club the previous night. He poked Gregory with a rake and determined that he was by now definitely dead. But he didn't want to hide the body. He was adamant that they leave Gregory somewhere he would be found so the family could bury him. And he called his friend Herbert Tyrone to help move the body. And they wrapped him in a blanket, put him in the trunk of Cleet's girlfriend's car, and then later that night drove over to Cobb Park and placed him on the bench, where he would be found the following day. They then made efforts to destroy the evidence by removing the windshield of the car and burning the seats, and then Chante just continued her life like nothing had happened. In fact, the following week, she and T. Fry went back to Joe's Big Bamboo, and as time passed, she probably thought that she was going to get away with it. That is until 4 months later when she was overheard bragging about it. The trial began on June 23, 2003, and it would last about a month. It was emotional to say the least, not to mention divisive. Chante Mallard pled guilty to tampering with evidence, but not guilty to murder. She was looking at anything from 5 years to life. A local prosecutor had told jurors to sentence Mallard, who was now 27, to life, due to the cruel nature of the crime. But the defence argued for leniency on the grounds that Chante had no previous convictions and had been placed in an extraordinary circumstance. They argued that what she did was horrible, but that she was not a horrible person. Mallard sobbed as she apologised to Gregory's son Brandon and her own family. She told the court she deserved prison time. But ultimately what turned this case from a tragic accident to murder was Gregory's survivability. The county medical examiner, Dr. Peerwani, testified that Gregory would have survived his injuries had medical attention been sought, because the crash didn't cause any injuries to his vital organs. He told the court that Gregory would have lived for about 2 hours, and it would take the jury less than an hour to deliver their verdict.
All right. Jury sent out a note that they've reached a verdict. State ready?
State's ready, Your Honor.
Defense ready?
We're ready, Your Honor.
I'll admonish everybody in the audience that there is to be no reaction no matter what the verdict is. Bring in the jury. I'll ask the presiding juror, has the jury reached a verdict?
Yes, it has.
Would you please hand the verdict form to the bailiff? And I'll ask the presiding juror, is this the unanimous verdict of the entire jury?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. In cause number 0837152D, Style State of Texas versus Chante Mallard. Verdict form is to count 1. We, the jury, find the defendant, Chante Mallard, guilty of the offense of murder as charged in count 1 of the indictment signed by the presiding juror. As to count 2, we, the jury, find the defendant, Chante Mallard, guilty of the offense of tampering with evidence as charged in count 2 of the indictment signed by the presiding juror. Does either side request a poll?
Not from the state, Your Honor. No, Your Honor.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, you may be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to accept your verdict and have it filed with the clerk of the court as the unanimous verdict of the entire jury. This concludes the first half of the trial. Y'all have been more than patient with us. It being almost noon, why don't we go on and take the noon break? If you'll go with the bailiffs, they'll take care of you. Thank you.
Later, Chante Mallard would be sentenced for the crimes of murder and tampering with evidence, and during the sentencing, Brandon Biggs issued his own statement to the court.
And I'll ask the presiding juror, is this a unanimous verdict of the entire jury?
Yes, Your Honor.
In cause number 037152D, styled State of Texas versus Chante Mallard. Verdict form is to count 1. We, the jury, having found the defendant, Chante Mallard, guilty of the offense of murder, assess her punishment at confinement in the Institutional Division of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice for a period of 50 years, and in addition to such confinement, assess a fine of none. And we further do not recommend community supervision, signed by the presiding juror. Verdict form is to count 2. We, the jury, having found the defendant Chante Mallard guilty of the offense of tampering with evidence, assess her punishment at confinement in the Institutional Division of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice for a period of 10 years, and in addition to such confinement, assess a fine of none. And we further do not recommend community supervision, signed by the presiding juror. Court's going to find this is the unanimous verdict of the entire jury and have it filed with the clerk of the court as such. Is there any legal reason why sentence should not be pronounced at this time?
No, Your Honor.
All right.
Brandon Biggs would like to speak on behalf of the victim's family.
First of all, we would like to thank the jury. You've been so patient, and we would just like to say thank you. To the Mallard family, we would like to say that we're sorry for your loss as well, because there are no winners in a case like this. Just as we all lost Greg, you all will be losing your daughter. But while you will have phone calls and correspondence and visitation, we don't have these anymore. So in return, I would ask that you would guide Chante and that you'd pray for her and that you'd protect her. But we would like to say that we're sorry for your loss as well. To Chante, I personally would like to say that I would accept your apology. But in return, I hope that you would accept my forgiveness. I hope you'll accept the forgiveness of Jesus Christ. While forgiveness is given, restitution is still required. So I ask that during your punishment, you'd seek the advice and the wisdom of your family and your loved ones so that you can live a productive life. Thank you. Before I step down, I would also like to say thank you to the prosecution for all the long hours and long nights you've spent here. Thank you very much.
Moments later, Chante Mallard was escorted out of the courtroom in custody as her mother sobbed. 50 years plus 10 years to run concurrently. Under Texan law, a person must serve half the sentence before they become eligible for parole, which means she'll be eligible in 2027. Cleet Jackson was sentenced to 10 years for his role in the crime, and Herbert Tyrone, who didn't testify in court, got 9. T. Fry didn't serve any time due to her valuable testimony. Today, Brandon is now married with 3 children, having named a son after his beloved father. It's a disturbing case, but a fascinating one, no doubt. It has since spawned numerous media adaptations, such as an episode of CSI, Law & Order, Fargo, and 911, as well as feature-length films Stuck, Hit and Run, and Accident on Hill Road. All decisions have consequences, some greater than others. I once had a blonde Mohican. That was a bad decision. But leaving a man trapped in your windshield to slowly pass away is something else entirely. But there are some who say the punishment outweighs the crime. Chante Mallard's projected release date is March 2052, at the age of 76. Let me know what you think in the comments. And thanks for spending your time with me and watching. I really do appreciate it. And if you enjoyed this video, give it a quick like, and I'll see you next week. Bye.